Jake stepped out of his rental car onto the bustling streets of Brooklyn, tugging at his deliberately worn jeans and plain white t-shirt. The neighborhood pulsed with life, children playing on stoops, music drifting from open windows, and the aroma of various cuisines mingling in the air. Despite his wealth, he had never ventured into this part of the city before. Graffiti art decorated building walls, some crumbling at the edges. Rusty fire escapes zigzagged up facades, adorned with drying laundry. A group of teenagers played basketball using a hoop with a broken net. Jake noticed the contradictions, worn-down infrastructure alongside vibrant community life. Walking up to Aisha's family home, a modest two-story building with peeling paint, Jake's heart raced. He had practiced his cover story repeatedly. He was Jake Thompson, a construction worker from Manhattan. No hint of Jake Morrison, the tech company CEO worth millions. Aisha's mother, Mrs. Rahman, opened the door with a warm smile that immediately put Jake at ease. "Welcome to our home," she exclaimed, pulling him into an unexpected hug. The house interior was modest but immaculately clean, with family photos covering every wall. The furniture showed signs of wear but was carefully maintained. Aisha's younger siblings, Malik and Sarah, bombarded Jake with questions about his life and work while their father, Mr. Rahman, observed quietly from his worn armchair. The living room was small, forcing everyone to sit close together, creating an intimacy Jake hadn't experienced in his spacious penthouse. During dinner, served on mismatched plates around a cramped table, Jake watched Aisha interact with her family. She helped her mother serve the food, gently teased her siblings, and anticipated her father's needs before he could voice them. Her face lit up when Malik talked about his school project, and she offered immediate support when Sarah mentioned struggling with math. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter and playful arguments. Jake noticed how they shared food from their plates without hesitation, how they finished each other's sentences, and how they seemed to communicate through subtle glances and smiles. Despite the obvious financial constraints, evident in the carefully portioned food and mentions of budget concerns, joy permeated every interaction. This was different from his own family dinners, which were often formal affairs in expensive restaurants or catered events where business talk dominated. Here, in this small Brooklyn home, he witnessed genuine connection and unconditional love. As the evening progressed, Jake found himself relaxing into this new environment. He caught Aisha's eye across the table and saw her proud smile. She belonged here, among these people who valued relationships over possessions. For the first time, he questioned whether she would feel equally at home in his world of corporate meetings and charity galas. The community center stood as a weathered brick building with faded lettering on its facade. Jake arrived early on Saturday morning, finding Aisha's family already there, setting up for what they called the annual community revival event. His hands felt awkward holding a toolbox, a prop he'd bought to maintain his construction worker facade. "Ever worked on stage lighting before?" Mr. Rahman called out, gesturing to a set of old spotlights that needed mounting. Jake's stomach tightened. In his real life, he hired people for such tasks. Now, he had to prove himself capable of manual labor. "I can figure it out," he responded, trying to sound confident. As he fumbled with the equipment, a tall man with broad shoulders approached. "Need a hand there?" The man introduced himself as Donnie Williams. Jake recognized him immediately, former NFL player who'd made headlines years ago when he left the sport at his peak. Now, here he was in worn jeans and a faded t-shirt, expertly handling the lighting equipment. Working together, Donnie shared his story. "Used to think success meant touchdown records and endorsement deals," he said, securing a spotlight. "Then I saw kids in this neighborhood with so much potential but no guidance. Found my real purpose here." Jake noticed the genuine fulfillment in Donnie's voice, so different from the hollow satisfaction he often felt after closing million-dollar deals. Throughout the day, Jake observed Donnie interacting with local teenagers. He helped them with homework, offered career advice, and coached them in sports. These weren't just casual interactions. Donnie knew each kid's story, their struggles, their dreams. He'd created something more valuable than any NFL contract, real impact on young lives. Aisha coordinated activities with natural leadership, moving between groups, solving problems, and encouraging volunteers. She handled conflicts with grace, whether it was disagreements over resource allocation or scheduling issues. Jake watched her navigate these challenges with a skill that rivaled his best corporate managers. "Your boyfriend's different from what I expected," Jake overheard Donnie telling Aisha during a break. "He's trying hard to fit in." Aisha's response made Jake's chest tighten. "He's showing me sides of himself I never knew existed." The irony of her words wasn't lost on Jake. Every genuine moment of connection he made here was built on a lie. Yet, as he worked alongside these people, carrying chairs, hanging decorations, solving practical problems, he felt more authentic than he had in years. By day's end, Jake's muscles ached from unaccustomed physical work, but he felt a deep satisfaction. The community center had transformed, not through expensive contractors or professional event planners, but through collective effort and shared purpose. As they cleaned up, Aisha slipped her hand into his. "Thank you for being here," she said softly. "This means everything to me." Jake squeezed her hand, the guilt of his deception warring with the growing realization that he was discovering parts of himself he never knew existed. During the planning meeting at the community center, Jake sat uncomfortably in a metal folding chair as Principal Martinez detailed the local school's challenges. Leaky roofs, outdated textbooks, broken heating systems, problems that could be solved with a fraction of what he spent on his car collection. "We're losing talented teachers because we can't match suburban salaries," Martinez explained, her voice tight with frustration. "Last winter, students wore coats in classrooms because the heating system failed." Jake's mind raced through calculations. He could fix everything anonymously through his foundation, but that would raise questions about the source of the money. Instead, he focused on immediate solutions within his supposed means. "What if we organized a skills-sharing program?" he suggested. "Local professionals could teach workshops, create mentorship opportunities." The idea gained traction, though Jake noticed skeptical glances from some community members. Marcus, a local business owner, voiced what others seemed to be thinking. "How long have you been in construction, Jake? Never seen you around the union meetings." The question caught Jake off guard. He fumbled through a vague response about recent career changes, aware of the growing suspicion in Marcus's eyes. The pressure of maintaining his facade intensified during subsequent meetings. Every casual conversation became a potential trap. When people shared stories about union work or construction projects, Jake had to carefully navigate around his limited knowledge, often changing the subject or making excuses to step away. His behavior didn't go unnoticed. Whispers followed him. Who was this outsider really? Why was he so interested in their community? Some defended him, pointing to his dedication and hard work. Others, like Marcus, kept their distance, watching him with wary eyes. The situation strained his relationship with Aisha. She noticed his increasing anxiety, the way he withdrew from certain conversations or avoided specific people. When she asked what was wrong, he deflected, creating the first real distance in their relationship. During one particularly tense meeting, Jake nearly slipped up while discussing budget allocations. He caught himself just before suggesting a donation amount that would have been impossible for someone earning a construction worker's salary. The close call left him shaken. The weight of his deception began affecting his sleep. At night, he lay awake in his luxury apartment, thinking about the genuine connections he'd made in the community. Donnie had started inviting him to mentor youth at the center. Mrs. Ramon saved him plates of home-cooked meals. The local kids called him Uncle Jake. Each authentic moment made his life feel heavier. He found himself pulling away from community events, making excuses about work commitments. Aisha noticed his withdrawal but misinterpreted it as losing interest in her community. The hurt in her eyes when he missed an important planning session was almost unbearable. His two worlds were colliding. During the day, he managed his company remotely, making excuses about working from home. In the evenings, he rushed to Brooklyn, changing clothes in his car, always fearful of being discovered. The double life was taking its toll, not just on him, but on everyone who had come to trust and rely on him. The afternoon sun filtered through the community center's dusty windows as Jake helped set up for another planning session. That's when he first met Maria Rodriguez, struggling to balance a stack of papers while her youngest child tugged at her sleeve. Without thinking, Jake caught the papers as they started to slip. 3 jobs and still barely making ends meet, Maria explained later as they organized supplies. She worked as a janitor during the day, a restaurant dishwasher in the evenings, and took online classes late at night. Her eldest son watched the younger ones when she worked, sacrificing his own extracurricular activities to help the family. Jake listened as Maria detailed her daily routine, waking at 4 a.m., preparing meals for the entire day, dropping her youngest at a neighbor's house, rushing to her first job. Every decision revolved around maximizing limited resources. When her son needed a new laptop for school, she sold her wedding ring. When the heating bill spiked, she took extra shifts instead of buying new winter clothes for herself. The hardest part isn't the work, she confided, sorting through donated school supplies. It's watching my children understand too early that they can't have what other kids have. Her voice remained steady, but Jake noticed her hands trembling slightly. He thought about the casual way he'd recently spent thousands on a watch. Maria's story forced Jake to confront the reality of his deception from a new angle. Here was someone who worked herself to exhaustion just to provide basics for her family, while he played at being working class. His privilege allowed him to step in and out of this life at will, something Maria and others in the community could never do. The contrast between Maria's authentic struggle and his manufactured one ate at his conscience. During community meetings, he caught himself checking his luxury watch hidden under his sleeve, aware that its value could pay for a semester of Maria's son's college education. Meanwhile, Aisha noticed changes in Jake's behavior. She saw how he lingered after meetings, speaking with community members, asking detailed questions about their struggles. His interest seemed genuine, but something felt off. The construction worker who had first visited her family's home would not have known to ask about educational investment strategies or nonprofit governance structures. During one evening event, Jake forgot to maintain his affected working-class accent while passionately discussing potential solutions for the school's funding issues. Aisha's sharp glance in his direction suggested she'd noticed. He quickly excused himself, claiming fatigue from a long workday. The roles were becoming harder to juggle. In meetings with Maria about her children's education, he had to stop himself from offering financial solutions that would have blown his cover. When Aisha questioned his growing involvement in the community's financial planning, he struggled to provide convincing explanations that fit his supposed background. His genuine desire to help ward with the increasingly complicated web of lies he'd woven. Each day brought new challenges to his facade, while his real connection to the community, especially to people like Maria, deepened. He found himself investigating ways to anonymously support families like hers through his company's outreach programs, but even these efforts felt hollow compared to the authentic struggles he witnessed. The community event transformed the worn-down center into a vibrant hub of activity. Colorful banners hung from ceiling beams Jake had helped install, and the aroma of diverse homemade dishes filled the air. Children darted between tables while parents and neighbors chatted, creating a tapestry of community life that both inspired and tormented Jake. Every smile, every thank you, every pat on the back felt like a sharp reminder of his deception. He'd become deeply embedded in their lives, helping create budgets, suggesting fundraising strategies, connecting with families. His genuine care for the community conflicted painfully with the lie at the center of his involvement. The breaking point came during Donnie's speech about community authenticity. "In this neighborhood, we don't have much, but we have truth," Donnie declared, his eyes sweeping the crowd before settling on Jake. "We know who we are, and we stand by it." The words hit Jake like physical blows. After the speech, Donnie cornered Jake near the makeshift refreshment station. "Let's talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. They moved to a quiet corner, away from the celebration. "Your hands," Donnie began, "they don't match your story." Jake instinctively shoved his manicured hands into his pockets. "Construction work leaves marks, calluses. Yours look more suited to a keyboard than a jackhammer." The observation hung between them, heavy with implication. Jake considered denying it, but Donnie's steady gaze broke through his defenses. "The community doesn't need another outsider playing savior," Donnie continued, his voice low but intense. "These people, they trust you now. They've let you into their lives, their homes. Whatever game you're playing, it needs to end." Before Jake could respond, Aisha's voice carried across the room. She was discussing future plans with a group of parents, her enthusiasm evident as she outlined her vision for the school's development. "We'll create opportunities our children never dreamed possible," she promised. "With everyone's help, including Jake's, we'll build something lasting." The moment crystallized Jake's dilemma. His lie had started as a way to understand Aisha's world, but it had evolved into something more complicated. He discovered a sense of purpose he'd never found in his corporate life, forged connections that felt more real than any he'd made in his privileged circles. Retreating to the empty hallway, Jake overheard Aisha sharing her dreams with Maria. She spoke about establishing a proper college fund for the community's children, creating job training programs, renovating the school. Her plans were ambitious but constrained by limited resources Jake could easily provide if he revealed his true identity. Yet he also heard the pride in her voice when she talked about their grassroots efforts, the dignity in building something from nothing. Would his revelation destroy that? Would she see all his involvement as manipulation? The weight of these questions pressed down on him as the celebration continued inside. Through the door's window, he watched the community he'd grown to love celebrate their collective achievements. They'd accomplished so much with so little, while he sat on wealth that could transform their lives overnight. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to understand Aisha's world, he'd lost himself in it, and now faced losing everything he'd gained. The evening after the confrontation with Donnie, Jake sat alone in his luxury penthouse, surrounded by evidence of his privileged life, expensive art, designer furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Everything felt hollow compared to the warmth of Aisha's family's cramped living room. He drafted and deleted dozens of texts to Aisha, each attempt at confession falling short. How could he explain that his deception came from a place of love? That pretending to be poor had somehow made him richer in ways he never expected. The words seemed inadequate, even pathetic. Through his corporate office's surveillance system, Jake watched remotely as Aisha met with her parents at the school. They walked through empty classrooms, pointing out needed repairs, discussing dreams for new programs. Her father, despite his exhaustion from a long day of work, listened intently and offered practical solutions. Her mother took notes, already planning fundraising efforts. Their dedication stirred something in Jake. He'd spent years measuring success in profit margins and market share. Now, watching this family pour their hearts into improving their community with limited resources, he questioned everything about his former definition of achievement. He made his decision. Tomorrow, he would come clean. He'd explain everything, his fears about their different backgrounds, his desire to understand her world, and how that understanding had transformed him. He'd offer to use his resources to help the community, but on their terms, with their guidance. Jake began preparing his speech, rehearsing in front of his bathroom mirror. "I'm not who you think I am," he practiced, "but who I've become because of you is more real than who I've ever been." The words sounded sincere because they were true, possibly the most honest thing he'd say since this all began. His plans for revelation came to an abrupt halt when his phone rang. The caller ID showed his father's name, Howard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Enterprises. Jake's stomach dropped. His father never called unless something was wrong. "The board meeting's been moved up," Howard's voice crackled through the speaker. "We need you back at headquarters immediately. The merger's in trouble." The corporate world Jake had been avoiding crashed back into his life. His father continued, "Your absence has been noticed. Questions are being asked." Jake tried to protest, explain that he needed one more day, but his father cut him off. "Son, this is your legacy we're talking about. Everything we've built. You can't throw it away for whatever game you're playing in Brooklyn." The words hit home. His father knew something about his double life. Standing at his window, looking toward Brooklyn, Jake faced his moment of truth. The merger would make his company billions, secure his family's legacy. But running back to his corporate life meant abandoning the community event, leaving Aisha without explanation, betraying the trust he'd built. His phone buzzed with a text from Aisha, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow. The kids are so excited about your carpentry workshop." Each word felt like a knife to his gut. He had to make a choice, the corporate empire he was born into or the community life he'd chosen. The night stretched endlessly as Jake paced his penthouse, his father's words battling with memories of the community in his mind. His phone kept buzzing, urgent emails about the merger competing with messages from Aisha about tomorrow's event. Two worlds colliding, demanding a choice. He pulled up the merger documents on his laptop, projected profits in the billions, thousands of jobs at stake, his family's expectations weighing heavily. Then he opened his photo gallery, candid shots of community meetings, children's smiling faces at the center, Aisha teaching a class. The contrast was stark, yet the decision wasn't as simple as choosing between wealth and authenticity. Jake hadn't touched his corporate accounts in weeks, immersing himself in Brooklyn's community life. Now, staring at his bank statements, he realized he could single-handedly fund every project the community dreamed of. But would money alone solve anything? He'd watched them build something more valuable than wealth: genuine connection, mutual support, shared purpose. Meanwhile, Aisha noticed Jake's recent distraction. During their phone call that evening, she heard the echo of his voice in what sounded like an empty space, not the cramped apartment he claimed to live in. When she mentioned it, his hurried explanation about being at work rang false. "Is everything okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "You seem different lately." Jake fumbled through another excuse, each lie adding to his burden. After hanging up, Aisha sat in her family's kitchen, turning over inconsistencies in her mind, his occasional slip into sophisticated vocabulary, his surprisingly deep understanding of financial systems, the way he sometimes forgot to maintain his working-class demeanor. The morning of the event arrived with a flurry of activity at the community center. Jake showed up early, his decision made but his heart heavy. He helped set up chairs, his expensive watch hidden beneath his sleeve, every interaction feeling like borrowed time. Tension filled the air as people gathered. Aisha kept shooting questioning glances his way, noticing how he checked his phone constantly, how his hands shook slightly when handling equipment. Something was clearly wrong, but she couldn't piece it together. The community center filled with families, teachers, and local residents. They all greeted Jake warmly, the construction worker who'd become part of their family. Children ran up to show him their projects, parents asked his advice about repairs, teenagers sought his guidance about career choices. Each interaction twisted the knife of guilt deeper. Just before the event was set to begin, Aisha cornered him behind the stage. "What aren't you telling me?" she demanded, her eyes searching his face. "I know you're hiding something, Jake. Whatever it is, we can work through it together." The sincerity in her voice nearly broke him. At that moment, his phone buzzed again, his father's message about the urgent board meeting. The merger papers needed his signature within hours. Jake stood frozen between Aisha's questioning gaze and the corporate demands threatening to expose his true identity. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and he could no longer control its collapse. The community center buzzed with anticipation as Jake approached the makeshift podium. Faces he'd grown to know and care about looked up at him expectantly, Maria with her children, Donnie in the back row with his arms crossed, Aisha's family in the front, beaming with pride. His prepared speech about community values sat heavily in his pocket, but Jake decided to speak from his heart instead. "When I first came here," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I thought I understood success. I measured it in numbers, achievements, possessions." The audience nodded, assuming he meant modest working-class accomplishments, not his millions. "But this community taught me that true success isn't about what you have, it's about who you become through the people around you." His eyes met Donnie's, who gave him a subtle nod, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. "It's about showing up for each other, building something together, believing in possibilities even when resources are scarce." Aisha took the stage next, her presence commanding attention. "My family came to this neighborhood with nothing but hope," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Everything we've built here, we've built together. Every improvement, every program, every success story, it's all because we refuse to let our circumstances define us." Jake watched her speak, seeing the fierce pride in her eyes as she detailed their community's achievements. She talked about children improving their grades, families supporting each other through hard times, small victories that added up to significant change. Her words made his deception feel even heavier. The atmosphere in the room was electric with shared purpose and pride when a commotion at the back door drew everyone's attention. A reporter from the New York Times pushed through the crowd, tablet in hand, displaying a photo of Jake in an expensive suit at a corporate gala. "Jake Morrison," the reporter announced loudly, CEO of Morrison Technologies, worth an estimated $2.3 billion. "Care to comment on why you're pretending to be a construction worker in Brooklyn?" The room fell silent. Jake felt hundreds of eyes turn to him, expressions morphing from confusion to shock to betrayal. Aisha's face drained of color as she stared at the tablet screen, then at Jake, then back at the screen. Her father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor in the dead silence. Maria pulled her children closer, as if protecting them from the truth. The carefully built world of trust and connection shattered in an instant. Someone in the back demanded answers. Another person called him a fraud. Donnie stepped forward, placing himself between the angry crowd and Jake, but his expression showed his own disappointment. Jake reached for Aisha, but she stepped back, her eyes filled with hurt and confusion. Everything was a lie, she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. The pain in her voice cut deeper than any angry shout from the crowd. The community center erupted into chaos. Half the room pushed forward, demanding explanations, while others pulled back in disgust. Was this some kind of social experiment? Someone shouted. Were we your poverty tourism? Called another. The words hit Jake like physical blows. Families who had welcomed him into their homes now looked at him with betrayal. Maria hugged her children close, the trust in her eyes replaced by hurt and anger. All those times I told you about our struggles, she said, her voice breaking, were you just studying us? The community split into factions. Some defended Jake, pointing to his genuine contributions. He helped design the youth program, one teenager argued. Money or not, he showed up every time we needed him. Others saw only manipulation. He could have helped us without the lies, Mr. Rahman countered, his usual gentle demeanor hardened with disappointment. Aisha stood apart from everyone, her arms wrapped around herself. When Jake tried to approach her, she held up her hand to stop him. Don't, she said, her voice flat. I don't even know who you are. She turned and walked out, leaving Jake surrounded by the wreckage of his deception. The next few days passed in a blur of unanswered calls and closed doors. Jake showed up at the community center, but people turned away when they saw him. His genuine connections had been poisoned by lies. Even Donnie, who had suspected the truth, kept his distance. Local news picked up the story, Billionaire's Brooklyn masquerade. Social media exploded with opinions. Some painted him as a manipulative rich man playing with poor people's lives. Others suggested he had genuine intentions but chose the wrong method. Jake stayed silent, knowing no explanation could justify deceiving people who had trusted him. In his penthouse, Jake watched security footage from the community center through his company's surveillance system. He saw Aisha meeting with community leaders, her face determined despite obvious fatigue. They were reorganizing the programs he'd helped create, removing his influence while trying to preserve the progress they'd made. The isolation felt suffocating. His corporate world offered no comfort, board members called constantly about the merger, but their voices seemed distant and irrelevant. He'd found something real in Brooklyn, something authentic, and had destroyed it with lies. Jake retreated to his office, surrounded by evidence of his wealth, awards, certificates, photographs with business leaders. None of it meant anything compared to the simple joy of helping a child with homework at the community center or sharing a meal with Aisha's family. Sitting alone in his luxury apartment, Jake watched Brooklyn's lights twinkle across the river. The distance between his world and theirs seemed greater than ever. His phone displayed dozens of missed calls from his father and board members, but the only notification he cared about was Aisha's last message, "We trusted you. All of us." The rain poured over Brooklyn as Jake stood outside the community center, soaked but determined. Inside, Aisha was leading a meeting about the center's future. Through the window, he could see her confident posture, though her eyes carried the weight of recent events. He waited until the meeting ended, watching people file out, some shooting him angry glances, others avoiding eye contact entirely. When only Aisha remained, he entered, water dripping from his clothes. For once, he wasn't pretending, his expensive suit was ruined, his hair disheveled, his carefully maintained CEO image abandoned. "I've been lying about who I am," Jake began, his voice steady despite his shivering, "but I've never been more honest about who I want to be." He pulled out a folder containing legal documents. "I'm transferring ownership of Morrison Technologies Community Development Fund to a board controlled by this neighborhood. $20 million, managed by the people who know best what this community needs." Aisha studied the papers without touching them, her expression guarded. "More money thrown at problems?" she asked bitterly. "That's your solution?" "No," Jake replied, "it's not about the money. I'm stepping down as CEO." The words hung in the air. "I want to work here, for real this time. No lies, no pretense. I'll take any position you'll give me, even if it's cleaning floors. I just want to be part of what you're building." The door opened, and Mr. Rahman walked in, shaking his umbrella. "I wondered when you'd come back," he said, surprising both Jake and Aisha. "Did you know," he addressed his daughter, "that someone anonymously paid for Mrs. Chen's cancer treatment? And Maria's son's college tuition? All while this young man was pretending to be broke." Aisha turned to Jake, confusion crossing her face. Mr. Rahman continued, I've been in this country 30 years. You think I can't spot a rich man trying to act poor? He chuckled. The question was never about his money or his lies. It was about what he would choose to do with both. Jake stood stunned as Mr. Rahman explained how he'd investigated him weeks ago, discovered his identity, but chose to watch. You could have stayed in your tower, the older man said, but you kept coming back. Not for Aisha, not for show, but because something here changed you. Aisha remained silent, processing her father's words. Finally, she spoke, You hurt us, Jake. Trust isn't something you can buy back. She paused, then added softly, but maybe it's something you can earn back. The three of them stood in the quiet community center, rain drumming on the roof. Outside, children played in puddles, parents hurried home from work, and the neighborhood continued its daily rhythm. Inside, something profound was shifting. Start over, Aisha said finally. Not as a CEO playing worker, not as a billionaire savior, but as Jake. Just Jake. Show us who you really are, and let us decide if that person belongs here. Mr. Rahman picked up the folder with the legal documents. Meanwhile, we'll put this money to good use. Not as your redemption, but as a tool for our community's dreams. He smiled at his daughter. After all, true wealth isn't in a bank account, it's in the choices we make and the people we choose to become. Jake nodded, understanding that this wasn't an ending or a neat resolution, but a beginning. A chance to build something real, without lies or pretense. As he looked at Aisha, he saw not forgiveness yet, but possibility, the same possibility that made this community strong, that turned struggles into triumphs, that transformed strangers into family. In the end, Jake Morrison, the billionaire CEO, had to lose everything to find what he was truly worth.